so happy we alive. We together can survive.
Good evening. I'm Patrick Moore, and welcome to Louisville Late Night. This evening, we are privileged and delighted to have with us American author, playwright, poet, teacher, feminist activist, and philanthropist, Sallie.Bingham. Sallie is, she's a prolific writer, and I just want to briefly read a review I just noticed on Amazon regarding Sallie's new book, The Blue Box, which we're going to be talking about today. This review says, "The Blue Box reveals beyond the shadow of a doubt that truth really is stranger than fiction. Like Natalie Cole singing with her father even after his passing, Sallie.Bingham weaves together a riveting story of 3 generations of women literally in their own words, yet seamlessly interwoven with hers. Although privilege may be associated with these strong women, it's not as if they were spared the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. In their unique and literary way, these foremothers survived and thrived through tumultuous times. The Blue Box chronicles both their triumphs and limitations in the context of a complex cultural milieu. Most of all, their experience brings to life and serves as a key to understanding the historic hurricanes our predecessors lived through and learned from. Like Gone with the Wind and Titanic, The Blue Box powerfully puts us back in touch with our common catharses, and in so doing reveals us to ourselves. Sallie.Bingham, welcome to Louisville Late Night.
Thank you so much, and what a wonderful review. I'm so pleased to hear that. I had read it, but it's wonderful to hear you read it, Patrick. This is the kind of thing that helps us writers so much to help the readers of our books to find the book.
Well, it's an amazing thing to me, and I can't imagine how you feel as a professional writer. Picking up the newspaper and seeing, I don't know what, Bill O'Reilly or Sean Hannity on the New York Times bestseller list, and then a book like yours, which is truly a gem. It's one of the most interesting books I've ever read.
Thank you, Patrick.
And truly. And at the same time, this book needs to be turned into a movie or a mini-series, or it has to get to the public, more people like me that listen to book TV all weekend as opposed to reading all the books. Do you mind, Sallie, beginning at the beginning of The Blue Box and for those who are not familiar, telling us what it's all about?
Oh, I'd be delighted to do that. I'm just honored to have the opportunity. Well, the way it came about, I have a younger sister, Eleanor Bingham Miller, who lives in Louisville. I do not, as you know. I live in New Mexico, have for many years. But anyway, Eleanor was in charge of cleaning out our mother's house after she died in a suburb of Louisville called Glenview. And in the process of cleaning these things out, and I know many people have gone through this and know the enormous amount of work involved when you're cleaning out a house that your parents have lived in for 40 or more years, she discovered on the shelf of our mother's rather modest clothes closet a blue box. And she had never seen it before, and I don't think anyone in the family had ever seen it before, except for our mother, who actually had never mentioned it. She opened the blue box and found troves of letters, all neatly tied up with some notes attached, an old prayer book, ancient college blue books from the days when blue books were used to write answers to examinations. And she was just mystified. This was all a complete surprise to her. So she got in touch with me. I'm one of the writers in the family. And said, what do you think? Would this be interesting? And I said, I would love to see it. And then we consulted with our niece who lives in Louisville, Emily Bingham, who's a historian. And she, of course, saw the value of these documents, although none of us really knew at that point what they were. So about 3 years ago, when I was visiting in Louisville, Emily gave me the blue box. And as I say in the introduction, I was excited and also slightly apprehensive because, as we know, the past is very complex, and women are often the ones who record the underbelly of history, those stories that don't get told in the official accounts, the biographies and newspaper stories and so on. So I took it back home and began to carefully go through the contents, some of them very fragile. There were some letters from around 1812 that were extremely fragile, but fortunately, the paper was so good then and the ink was so good then that they were better preserved than some of the letters from the early parts of the 20th century. And I realized that this was the story or the stories of many people in my mother's family. They were primarily Richmond, Virginia people, and they were not well known to me at all. And, in fact, I don't think anyone in the family had really heard the stories of the Capertons and the Lefroys, because we'd all grown up hearing the stories of the much better-known Binghams, my father's family. So it was a treasure trove, and as I began to go through it, I realized there are many stories here, and certainly I can take some of them and weave them into the manuscript that now has become the Blue Box, 3 Lives in Letters, published last summer by Sarabande Books, a marvelous literary publisher in Louisville. So that's how it began.
Yes, I have to comment here that it's not just what someone says, but how they say it. And you are obviously a very skilled writer, but I have very limited literary anything. But I was amazed at this style of writing where it's chronologic, but you're writing, and then right in the middle of a sentence, even in the middle of a sentence, you'll switch to what your great-great-grandmother was writing in her memoir, and then you'll be talking again, and then you'll switch to what your great-grandmother was saying, and then again you'll switch to what your mother was saying, and they're all terrific writers, and the way you put all 3 together is I just never have seen it done before, and it's just a beautiful, it's a work of art unto itself. And that's without even talking about the content. But let's talk about the content here a little bit, and kind of maybe go back to the beginning. There's so many stories here. I mean, Sallie Montague. Now, Sallie Montague's grandmother that was captured by the Indians and had her child smashed against a tree?
Yeah, that's right. That was a woman going back to the late 18th century who lived in West Virginia, and with her husband they set out over the mountains to go to Kentucky, as many people were doing. Kentucky was then considered the West, and there was land there, and it was an opportunity. And on the way, of course, they were invading the traditional grounds of the Shawnee Indians, and they either didn't know or didn't care about that, or possibly both. In any event, this party of Shawnee Indians came upon them, and there was a struggle, and several of the men were killed or wounded, and this woman and her infant and another woman were captured by the Shawnee and taken on a long ride, including fording the Ohio River, to a Shawnee camp on the other bank, and she lived there for 4 years quite happily. Had another child after this first child was dashed against a tree, and I should add the reason the Shawnees did that is that they were being pursued and they knew this crying baby would give them away. She had another child during this 4 years in the Shawnee camp and made great friends with a lot of the women whom she called squaws, and was protected by one of the chiefs of the tribe, And so really, it was not the story of suffering and hardship that a lot of the so-called captivity narratives give us. It was much more a story of a very successful adaptation in which she learned to respect a lot of the ways of these people who were then called savages. As we know, they were not savages. Mm-hmm. And it was not until 4 years later that she was redeemed, as she called it. She was bought for a ransom and went back to her original family in West Virginia and lived many more years there, remarried, had more children, and died in her 90s, having told this story to a lot of people, including one of her grandsons, who then wrote it down. And it was his account of her captivity that I used as the basis for the story in the Blue Box.
Yes, and I have to admit here that you mentioned that you were forced to get into American history more with writing the Blue Box, and it kind of touched something within myself that I became aware of two big denials of my own. As one is the whole Civil War was just such a bloody, traumatic event in American history, and also I've been told that I had ancestors that fought on both sides of the war, but anyway, basically, I had just totally shut out the Civil War until reading your book, and actually, the Montague family, it all centers around Richmond, Virginia, which is the capital of the Confederacy.
Yes.
And
oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, your family was very much involved with the whole situation in Richmond, to say the least. You might comment more, but Sallie, she was one of the first women of Virginia in the women's literary club there, was active in so many different aspects.
Yes, she was. She was born in 1850, so she was a teenager during the Civil War, which she probably didn't even call the Civil War. As you know, Southerners have other names for it. What was quite remarkable in the memoir that I quote from, her memoir written at the end of her life many years later, was that she really didn't remember very much about the violence and the bloodshed that was taking place all around Richmond. A disastrous wilderness campaign was within a few miles of Richmond, and there were many, many wounded Confederate soldiers streaming into the city. Very great problem of getting food. In fact, these families in Richmond, like hers, gave what were called starvation parties during the Civil War, when nothing was served but water, because there wasn't anything to serve. And so that Sallie has this rather golden memory of those years, and didn't seem to suffer very much from the hardships that were afflicting everybody in the city and elsewhere, is quite remarkable. But Patrick, this may also apply in some degree to you. I think the historical events that touch us very closely, as the Civil War touched everyone in this country, and are complex, as that war and all wars are complex. Sometimes it's a little easier just not to know much about them, because we don't really want to have to remember that the country was caught up in what was, up until the First World War, the bloodiest war that anyone in this country had ever witnessed in terms of the amount of dead. And absolutely essential, because I don't think there's any other way we would have arrived at the Emancipation Proclamation without the Civil War. But from Sallie's point of view, her family, which owned many slaves, felt that the slaves were, as people in the South used to say, members of the family, and really were not interested in being freed, and in fact didn't even leave once they were freed, but stayed there and were taken care of by the Montague family. So it's a very out-of-date and somewhat unreal version of the Civil War, which of course makes it very interesting to write about, since there were many people then, and probably some people now, who still maintain a rather, shall we say, rosy view of that conflict.
Yes, I'm sure. You're mentioning in the blue box that 800,000 young men volunteered for the Confederacy, and your Sally Montague's father's home was actually turned into a hospital for Confederate soldiers.
Yes.
And
She didn't serve, and that's another interesting and unusual thing about her family. Her father, John Caperton, never served. He was considered not draftable because he owned so many slaves, and there was a provision in the South during that time that if you owned more than a certain number of slaves, you were not expected to fight because you had to manage your plantations and your slaves. So he was exempt, and her 4 brothers were too young to fight, so she was part of one of the unusual families in the South that did not actually send any men into the Confederate Army. Probably that partly accounts for her rosy view of what was going on. Nobody that in her immediate family was killed in the war. I'm sure she had many friends that she knew about who did die, but no one in her immediate family volunteered or was drafted and lost their lives or were mutilated in those battles.
Yes, but I'm sure with food starvation riots in the street and the image that you painted of Sally, I think she was trying to get out of town and they were burnt. There was a moat around Richmond and they were burning the bridges.
River.
A river. And
the James River, yeah. That was after the Confederates had given up the capital and were retreating, and the Union soldiers were coming on to take the city, and Sally and her infant were at one of the family plantations outside of town, and her husband called her to come back, and she felt that she had to do that, and in a carriage, because that's the way people rode around in the 1860s, in a carriage driven by David, her African-American coachman, and as they approached Richmond and approached the river, they saw that one of the last bridges intact was on fire. The Confederates were actually setting the town on fire because they didn't want the Union soldiers to take the munitions that were stored along the James River and didn't want them to have easy access to the city, which is why they were burning the bridges. And miraculously, David, the coachman, was able to drive the carriage across this burning bridge so that Sally and her infant son could go back to arrive home safely. Really an amazing story. As most people know, horses are absolutely terrified of fire, and how David was able to get them through the fire, I don't know, but anyway, that's Sally's account of what happened.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just your mention of horses, it seems like in a unusual kind of way, horses are throughout the story, from bareback horse riding over in Ireland to this. Let's see, it was Geoffrey Lefroy. I'm moving forward a little bit here. Mm-hmm. This was, Geoffrey was primarily from Ireland. Yes,
he was from Northern Ireland. They were part of the big Anglo-Irish population that had settled in Northern Ireland and taken over a lot of the political structure, and were very much resented, and eventually during the days of the Irish Revolution were driven out. But at this point, they were still ensconced there, and Geoffrey, my great-grandfather, who was the son of this family, came to Richmond, Virginia, looking for his fortune, and happened to meet my great-grandmother, and they were married and had a short life together because he had TB, which at that point was a scourge for which there was no cure and not even really any treatment. And so he died about 6 or 7 years after they were married, leaving her with this little girl who became my grandmother, Helena. So that's a story in and of itself, this marriage which brought the whole of Northern Ireland into this Richmond family. They continued to have very close ties with the Lefroy family, made many trips during the summer to visit, And it's a strong and very interesting part of the family history about which I knew absolutely nothing.
It's a bit of a tangent, but back to the horses for a moment. You were talking about Anthony, who is Geoffrey Lefroy's uncle, and his horse, Centaur. And as I recall, he was hunting over in Ireland and jumped over something, and both he and his horse were killed. And then they had a funeral for both Anthony and for Centaur, the horse. That's
right. Now that we don't know if that's myth or not, Patrick. I've never heard of a joint funeral for a horse and its rider, but that was the uncle who lived at this place called Carey Glass Manor and had a stable there, and this horse, which he'd been used for hunting, fox hunting in Ireland for many, many years. So when he did finally have this disastrous fall, the story goes that the minister who had ridden often with this Lefroy decided that it would be appropriate to have a funeral that included both man and rider.
Yes. Also, just another little theme here is you're bringing back things that many of us don't want to even think about, like the Civil War and slavery in particular. You mentioned another fact that almost 3,500 blacks were lynched or murdered between 1882 and 1968 because of imaginary crimes.
Yes.
And
you know, it's interesting, not many people in Louisville seem to realize that there was an enormous slave market in Louisville of African Americans being shipped up and down the Ohio. There is a plaque at the foot of 4th Street that commemorates the fact that there was a slave market there, but I've never encountered anyone in Louisville who is at all aware of that. Very much part of the history of Kentucky as a border state, which was the crossover for not only for African Americans fleeing north across the Ohio, but also for the traffic in slaves up and down the Ohio.
Yes, I just remembered what you reminded me of before, changing the subject just a bit about the horses. Is it your was it your father? Wasn't there a part where your dad gathered up a bunch of prime thoroughbreds and took them up to?
No, that was my grandfather.
That was your grandfather.
Irishman.
Okay.
into buying and selling horses during his brief life in Richmond. Yes.
I see. Okay. So I'm just another image. Back to Sallie for a second is the Wild Buffalo Bill show. That's something I have heard about in history, and the fact that she actually met him and he gave her a memento and he was riding with Wild Buffalo Bill. That's a hoot.
It really is. Sallie was a widow for the majority of her life. For about 40 years, she was a widow after her Irish husband died of TB. And at some point during those years, when she was living with her family in Richmond, which is what widows did in those days, for economic reasons and also for respectability, the family went to see Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. He was touring all over the country and Europe at that time. And as he was driving the Deadwood coach around the ring, he noticed Sallie. We assume she was in fact, we know from her photograph she was a very attractive woman. And he asked to be introduced and managed the introduction and managed to get permission from her family, because although she was long an adult, permission would still be required to take her riding the next day. And she was a great horsewoman, and they went riding, and then that was it. He was leaving, and they never saw each other again. But he sent back to her a riding crop with a silver top that had her initials engraved on it. And I was the one who inherited that as a girl. I was also riding, and unfortunately, somewhere along the way, it got lost.
Oh, well, I'm glad you remembered the story.
Yes, I remember the story. I don't have the crop anymore.
But it is remarkable. And so then, coming down through the years, we have Sally's daughter and Geoffrey Lefroy had Helena. And
That's right.
Helena was an only child?
Yes, she was an only child.
But she had 7 children, 6 of whom lived, 5 girls, 1 boy, and the one girl, your mother, Mary, is one of those 6 children. And interesting, she had the one son, author Clifford Caperton, pardon me, Caperton.
Boy, yeah.
He had quite a life in aviation.
Yes, he did.
He became a marine pilot and then flew over 3 million miles for American Airlines, and then became a cargo pilot doing extraordinary aviations, taking off the swamp down south with heavy loads that I don't think would pass today.
I think that may be missed. Never mind, it's very interesting.
But what about, but on top of all that, we have Charles Lindbergh making his historic flight across the Atlantic, and on his way to the coast, he was accompanied by one airplane, and it was piloted by none other than author Clifford Caperton.
That's right, and his letter, which I quote from in the Blue Box, which he wrote to his father, goes into detail about how he was following along beside Lindbergh and hoping to get a photograph of him, but his plane had engine trouble. This was the very early days of aviation when the planes were quite unreliable, and he realized that he would have to turn back before Lindbergh actually started out across the Atlantic. But it's an amazing account, and also everything about his life story is quite remarkable. He really, I think, enjoyed himself a great deal.
It sounds like he had 4 wives and no children.
Yes,
and he was he was a traveling man.
Yeah, he was a traveling man, and I think to the despair of some people in his family, but I think he probably enjoyed his life.
Again, it's one of the strongest cohesive elements of the book is that it really is a love story. I mean, to me, before we get into your mother's relationship with your dad, way back with John Henry Montague, you have letters where John Henry Montague's writing to Melinda Fox, his wife to be, and he's talking about their daughter Sally, that your namesake, your great grandmother, and he says that Melinda Fox is a pocket edition of Sally. And
Sally is the pocket edition of Melinda.
Right. Sally's the pocket. I thought that was so sweet.
Isn't that sweet? That's a very, very sweet letter.
It's just
they were often separated during the summer because Melinda would take the children and go to one of the plantations to get out of the heat in Richmond, and so John Henry would be there on the weekend, but not during the week. So he was writing her to say he looked forward so much to seeing her again and to the side-by-side conversation they would have, and then commenting on the 2 children that were the first of their 2 children. One of them was my great-grandmother Sally, and that she was a pocket edition of her mother, and that he wanted to be sure that the children all copied their mother and not him, because he felt their mother was a much better example of what they ought to be.
Yeah.
Very charming, very loving. They had a long and I think a very, very happy marriage. In fact, there's a photograph in the Blue Box of them on their 60th wedding anniversary, and they were still going strong, and both of them lived way up into their 80s, and I think had a very happy life together.
Yes, these are strong women. it's funny that you say 3 letters and 3 lives in letters when it really seems like 6 lives or 5 or 6 generations
Good
of.
point, Patrick. Good point. The primary, most of the letters that I quote are from those 3 women: my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother. But of course, as you say, they include a lot of information about many other relatives in the family. So it is more really like 6 or 7 lives, I think, in 3.
And the focus is and appropriately so, on the women in the family. This is about, generations of strong women, but it still is worth mentioning, or to me it's of interest, that your father's father was from North Carolina and was part of a family military school.
Bingham's in Asheville had run a military school for decades. That was their profession. They were all school teachers and ran what we wouldn't probably recognize as a military school because it was quite small and was moved around all over North Carolina and finally ended up in Asheville, and that was where they had their larger establishment that actually had barracks and a parade ground and so on. In its earlier incarnation, the Bingham Military School was basically just the school teacher's house and then these handful of boys who were boarded out around town, so it was not our view of a military school at all. It closed just before the First World War.
Right, but that tradition, if you will, of military awareness and service carried on from down through the family to your brother was Barry Jr. was a Marine officer, if I recall.
Yes. And my brother Worth was in the Navy. This was during the Korean War. Yes, there was definitely an emphasis on military service. I have many questions about that as we go into war after war, but that was the tradition, and it did grow out of that reverence for the military that the Bingham Military Schools certainly enshrined.
Yes, and another just a tradition, I don't know if this is a correct word for it, but the Protestant work ethic, just the notion that you're born to work. It said about you that you are born to write, which I think is so appropriate and on spot. But you have to be a driven writer to be as productive as you've been in your life. Aside from raising 3 children, the number of plays, books, novels, I'm amazed. I'm just amazed. But let's talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about your mom and dad's romance, because that was so. I didn't know anything about it, but the way I would describe it would be partly kind of like that. Mary, your mother, she went up to Radcliffe to college, and that's where she met Barry Bingham Sr.
That's right. And she had come from this Richmond family which had very little money and did not have the tradition of higher education, but she was determined that she was going to be the one who broke through that barrier and did get to college, and in order to do that, she had to avail herself of a scholarship which Radcliffe was offering at that time for girls who lived more than 60 miles away from Boston, which will show you how Boston-centric the colleges were and still are to some degree. So because she was a very bright and very industrious student, she was able to win that scholarship, and so she went to Radcliffe studying, majoring in classical studies and restoration drama, and some of the examination books and papers of hers that were in the blue box are really very impressive. She was clearly bright, determined, industrious student, at least until she met Barry, and then things began to change, as they often do, pretty radically, and I don't think she quite fulfilled her early promise.
Well, actually, she went beyond it in that she got a postgraduate fellowship to go to Athens and study classical literature and so forth. And as I recall, there were like 5 or 6 candidates. All of them were males, and she won that fellowship.
Yes, it's very prestigious. It was called the Norton Fellowship to the American Academy in Athens, and it was primarily designed for college graduates who were interested in becoming archaeologists or historians of various aspects of Greek culture. Was not really what she ended up doing, but she applied for it. She had the support of one of her professors at Harvard, and so she ended up there in the fall of 1928, the fall after she had graduated in June, and spent most of a year in Athens. It was not quite, I think, what the American Academy expected, because my father, by then they were in love, and so my father, Barry, decided he would go to Athens too, and he was very interested in having a good time and brought a group of his merrymaking friends, and this disrupted my mother's academic career to a great degree and caused her to get into a good deal of trouble with the authorities at the University of the American University. This was, again, something that I knew nothing about, because I had never heard about it. My mother never spoke of it, and it was very interesting to read the way she vigorously defended herself when the authorities at the American Academy were complaining that she was never on campus and never came to class and so on. She vigorously defended herself, denied all the accusations, and ended up in good standing there and completed her year, and then went back to the U.S., I think fully expecting that my father, by then, who had gone back to Louisville and was working as a trainee at WHAS, that my father would be willing to propose to her. Well, he wasn't. And so, as you noticed, Patrick, she had to then scramble around and find a way to support herself. She was not going to go back to Richmond, and so she worked hard and got a job at a very prestigious Boston publisher named Little Brown, and began to work there as an editorial assistant. She was determined to take care of herself, to support herself, not to fall back on living with her family in Richmond, and she had to earn every cent. She had no inherited money of any kind. So there she was in Boston working, and again, my father, not yet her husband, of course, or my father, would come up from Louisville, as she described it, with a trunk full of bourbon in the car, and they would have a couple of weeks of pretty riotous merrymaking, and then she would go back to her job, and he would go back to Louisville. So after 6 months or so of this, she decided it really wasn't working. He was not going to propose to her. He was having far too good a time as a bachelor. So she then took off for Paris and broke up with him and went to live with a friend of hers in Paris. That's the next part of the story.
Yeah. As I recall, you quoted her as saying that she had resolved to attend to the business of life. Wow. But you described before she went to Greece, you were describing the Roaring '20s, and you said that your mom and dad had a musical comedy romance. And
that was my father's term for it, yes.
And it certainly sounds like they had a wonderful time together, both before your mom went to Greece and after
Yes.
he and his entourage
A wonderful time.
arrived in Greece, and it's just I think the feel is of maturity. I mean, when your mom and dad got together and did get married, they had done many things that they wanted to do in life, or I don't know if you want to call it so on.
That's an important point. They were both by then in their late 20s. They had really had more fun than most people have in their whole lives. And I think they were both really willing to come back to Louisville and settle down. He was being groomed by his father, who owned the Courier-Journal and the Louisville Times, to take over eventually, which of course he did. And she went on to be the mother of 5 children and also to have a very vibrant career as the first editor of the book page at the Courier-Journal. Some people may remember that. And also as a powerful force in democratic politics, both in the state and nationally. So I think it was very important for both of them, probably particularly for my father, that they had this long courtship in which there was a lot of adventure and a lot of fun and a lot of other people involved, and nobody, my father didn't have to take it too seriously. That's why he called it a musical comedy relationship. I don't think my mother ever considered it a musical comedy relationship. I think she felt it had to lead to marriage. It had to lead to something more serious.
Well, it led to all of you guys, and
Yes, it did.
and anyway, it gives me an appreciation for the maturity of the whole family, if you will, just the environment of their loving relationship and coming together, and I want to just briefly read one little section from your book here, where you're talking about your foremothers. You say, for all 3 women, the ideas and prejudices of their times worked powerfully on their characters and their behavior. For Sallie, the pervasive myth of an inherent racial and class hierarchy distorted her observations of life in Richmond before and after the Civil War. In Helena's case, her native talent as a writer was cramped by her need to set down the romantic tales and humorous domestic essays she knew would sell. For Mary, the prestige and security of money and social power encouraged her increasingly indefensible faith in the absolute right of the privileged and educated to rule. And you say Sallie, Helena, and Mary supported and were in turn supported by their allegiance to the patriarchy in all its rigid, romanticized Southern guises. And I mention that because, in a sense, you stand in contrast, to all of that. Again, just like I told you, I pushed out the Civil War. I also pushed out the whole controversy within the Bingham family. Prior to reading the Blue Box, it was like, for me, hearing about a divorce of some friends or something, where you just really don't need to know all the details or whatever, but now, I didn't even realize that you had left Louisville, actually.
Oh, my goodness. Many people don't, and I left 23 years ago.
Yeah.
Patrick, I think in a way it's wise that you didn't get yourself immersed in all that happening 25 years ago. I don't think it really is of much use or profit to anybody. We all know there's a saying I just heard today about inherited money, which is the first generation makes it, the second generation grows it, and the third generation blows it. Because it seems that no family business can be sustained by the family for more than 3 generations. After all, the ability to just accept and carry on is maybe a little bit less accepted now than it would have been 20 or 30 years ago. There are individuals who don't want to be yoked to that particular machine. Certainly, in my case, it was not going to work for me, and that led to a lot of controversy and some fortunate and unfortunate consequences.
Yes, and blaming and so forth, like that. I think that all, in retrospect, all printed media, all newspapers, since the internet arrived, have had some problems. The Courier was known, and it's a bit of a paradox Louisville is in many ways, it's a southern town. It's, south of the Mason-Dixon line, and the Courier-Journal, as I've traveled around the country, I've always missed the Courier. I mean, when you're in a different, city reading other newspapers, it's nice to get back to the Courier. But on the other hand, it's like nowadays, I mean, there's the New York Times, the Huffington Post, and 150 other publications, that are all competing for people's attention. And that would have happened, regardless of whatever, however people wanted to portray, what took place. One thing I can say is not having read, there's two books written about your family by Pulitzer Prize winners. I have not read these books.
One is the Pulitzer Prize winner.
Oh.
There are actually 3 books.
Okay.
One written by a Vanity Fair writer, one written by a New York Times news reporter, as he was then, business reporter, and then a third book written by a freelance writer. None of them get the story right from my point of view. They had limited access to what I knew, and they also came with some prejudices attached, which often happens with outsiders writing about a family business. So it's important to remember that I'm the one who was there. They were not there during the years leading up to the sale or during the sale. They were coming in afterwards because they were drawn by the controversy and writing about it, as I say, from limited points of view.
Yes, that's certainly, again, I haven't read their books, but what comes through to me clear in the blue box is nothing of resentment or whatever, bad feeling, hostility, or anything like that. It's a wonderful story of some very interesting women going through some really hard times that all of our ancestors went through one way or another. And for me, it's kind of like Forrest Gump or something. I mean, it's a major traction of getting back into touch with those people and those times. And I can't help but wonder if you haven't, especially with all of your experience as a playwright, can't you see this as a movie, at least as a miniseries? Because that's
really outside of my field, Patrick. I don't know anything about writing television scripts or film scripts, so I really think if that was ever going to happen, it would be because somebody else gets interested in the project. I'm really tied to the printed page. I don't know how to venture out into those other realms. But I really appreciate the fact that you said that there is certainly no resentment or hard feeling in the blue box. I think that's true. After all, it's what happened in those women's lives is, decades and decades ago. And what happened in my life in terms of Louisville and the Courier-Journal is also almost 3 decades ago. And I would consider myself a really impoverished soul if I still had any hard feelings about what went on there. And, of course, this is something that needs to be noted. When the Courier-Journal and its other subsidiaries was sold in the late 80s, was the high point for newspaper sales.
Right.
If the sale had happened today, the paper would be worth very, very little, and all the people in the family who have benefited from the sale would find themselves not impoverished, but they would not have the sums of money that they have because of when the sale took place. So that's something that's always worth hanging on to in the midst of other questions about the sale.
So you get a regular call thanking you for arranging the timely.
Not yet, Patrick, not yet, and I'm not holding my breath.
Your father may have been a very wise man, but not much fun for you, putting you in that pivotal position of where something had to give, and it was a matter of sticking to your principles or going along with whatever the good old boys have done for the last few centuries, I guess it is.
And some of the good old girls, too. Well, you know, now with hindsight, I didn't think this at the time, but with hindsight, I think my father actually paid me an important compliment. I think he knew me well. He really helped me to get my start as a writer, a very important influence for me. He knew me well, and I think he probably realized that of all his surviving children, I was the one who could stand to be blamed. It wasn't going to wreck me. I wasn't going to have a nervous breakdown. And he needed to find someone who could be blamed because he did not want to be blamed himself as the majority shareholder for bringing about this sale. So I think in an odd way, I'm certainly not comforting at the time, but comforting with hindsight all these years later, I think he actually paid me an important compliment.
Yes, and it was also interesting the way that you graciously benefited from his encouragement of your becoming a creative writer rather than a journalist, which, you know, you could have become a journalist if you had been inclined.
It would have been tough in the years when I was growing up. There were very few women journalists. Usually the women on newspaper staffs were writing for home news and wedding news and that kind of thing. They were never put on to the big stories. So it would have been very difficult. I would have had to spend many years grinding out columns about recipes if I ever did get to the point of being allowed to write news stories. So I think he, of course, knew that and probably realized that it wasn't likely to change anytime soon. So it was a much more hopeful path for me to become a fiction and nonfiction writer and deal with the difficulties of book publishing rather than the difficulties of journalism.
I can't help but mention that you have taken, you've not only been prolific as a writer, but you've helped so many other people, in particular women playwrights, women writers, and you've taken philanthropy and turned it into social change like nobody else that I really can think of. And it's just a wonderful thing, and I hope that someday Louisville and womankind appreciates everything that you've given and done. And continue.
Thank you, Patrick. I've been very fortunate and blessed in my life. I have had enough money to do things for other women who don't have those kind of means, primarily the Kentucky Foundation for Women, which I started now 25 years ago with an endowment of $10 million, which exists to this day and does, I think, very important work in terms of grants for women artists who are either willing to call themselves feminists, which is rarer and rarer, or at least are willing to see themselves as agents of social change. That's been my greatest gift anywhere. I never would be able to do that kind of thing again, but it gives me great satisfaction to be able to give back to the community. After all, the money that the Bingham companies had garnered over the decades was often the money that women had helped them to earn. Women at that point were largely in the lower echelons in businesses. They were the secretaries and the mail deliverers and the workers in the cafeterias and so on. So it was really partly to pay back to them that I decided to use that large part of my proceeds to establish the foundation. Also, one of the things I'm really grateful to for the way I was raised is that we were taught from early that we did not make the money that we would eventually inherit, and that therefore we had a particular obligation to give back to the community. We couldn't just simply be comfortable and buy houses and cars and boats and so on. We would have to contribute something to the community, because it's to those to whom much is given, much is expected. And I think that's a tradition that we've largely lost sight of these days. I don't think many children coming from well-off families are taught that they must give something back.
Yeah, so you are one wonderful example, and I just don't know what to say. I just hope that Louisville will eventually give you the appreciation and recognition that you deserve.
Well, thank you, Patrick. Actually, I'm well rewarded by the fact that the foundation does benefit many women. And in a way, that's all the thank you I need. Well, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you, and I think we're just about at the end, don't you?
Yes, we're just seconds are just dripping by. I'm trying to stop them, but we're going to have to say goodbye. I hope that we can reconnect maybe after you publish your next book about...
I'd love to do that, Patrick. It's a real honor to talk to you, and you have such a good grasp of what I'm trying to do, and I appreciate it so much. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sallie Bingham, for being with us on Louisville Late Night this evening.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
We so happy we alive, we together can survive.